Okay. So good afternoon. Thanks for coming here this afternoon to hear about the Bird-Friendly Maple Project. My name's Steve Hagenbuch, and I'm a conservation biologist and forester with Audubon, Vermont. Folks familiar with Audubon, the organization? We're a nonprofit, conservation nonprofit that focuses on birds and the habitats that they need, both today and into the future. And we're part of the National Audubon Society, so we have state programs all around the U.S. That are focused on their own particular conservation issues as they relate to birds. Here in Vermont, guess what our #1 priority in terms of types of habitat is? The woods. Forests, right? Forest birds is really kind of at the top of our priority list because we just have so much forest out there. And we have a lot of birds that go along with those forests. And so, kind of going along with that, we're going to be presenting on one of the projects that fall under our forest bird conservation efforts, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But I wanted to get just a brief sense of you guys. How many of you do produce maple syrup? Okay. How many of you tap less than 1,000 trees? And you don't. How many do you tap?
About 4,600.
4,600?
On my property.
Okay.
None anymore.
Oh, none anymore.
I'm a reporter with the Commons.
Okay, great. All right. So I figured out who you are as well. Okay, we got everybody. So pretty small scale in general, producers. And that's okay. This project that we're going to be talking about really is for all scales of producers, from the small hobby producers. I should have raised my hand. I also do make syrup as well on a small scale. But it's also, we have people involved with this project who have over 100,000 taps. So it really kind of spans the spectrum of folks that are out there and can get involved with it. So kind of the format for the presentation here this afternoon is just a little bit of context and background about where did we come up with this idea, what's it all about, and then we'll get into kind of the meat of the program, which is how could you get involved if you were interested in being part of this project. So this first slide, and I should also make sure I state right up front that this is a project that Audubon started back in 2014 as a partnership with the Vermont Maple Sugar Makers Association and the Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. So make sure we keep that in there up front. This is probably some information that is not new to anybody in this room if you are in the realm of maple syrup in any way. This basically is showing us from the USDA agricultural statistics for last year's production, where in the country do we find most maple syrup produced? And is it any surprise to anyone here that Vermont leads the way? No, I didn't think so. So last year we made over 2 million gallons of syrup, which then the orange line shows us that was just over 50% of the entire U.S. production coming out of Vermont. Next in line, but quite down the line, is New York State, Maine third in production, and then really go into the upper Midwest and PA, and then New Hampshire kind of at the end. There's other states in there as well, Massachusetts, Connecticut that I didn't bother putting on, but this is kind of a slide just to remind us, how important we are when it comes to maple syrup production. Again, most people in this room know that, but fewer people know that we're also home to some of the greatest number of bird species during the breeding season of anywhere else in the country as well. We call this species richness. The number of birds that we find here in our forests of Vermont from, say, mid-May through September. And I say mid-May through September because a lot of the richness of species that we find in our forest is made up of migratory bird species. So right now, if we go out into the sugar bush or other forests, we might find some chickadees, some nuthatches, some woodpeckers, those year-round residents, but we're not finding the larger abundance of those that makes up that high richness of species that we have because they're migratory. So right now they are in places like, that might sound appealing to some of us, Mexico, Central America, or even South America in some cases. So I'm going to flip back. Just take a look at this map. The colors represent the number of species encountered, forest species specifically, encountered in a program called the North American Breeding Bird Survey. It's one of the longest running bird survey programs that we have going on in North America. It was back in the 1960s. And so the darker orange color representing where we find the greatest richness, the greatest number of species. So look at where that greatest richness is. Now let's go back to that first slide. We have Vermont, New York, Maine, Wisconsin, and Michigan, really at the tops of things. When we go back to that map, we can see that there's a lot really close parallel between where we find that high richness of bird species and where most of the syrup in the U.S. is produced from. So this is all to say that there's a very close tie-in, parallel, between the maple syrup industry and global bird conservation. Yes, I did say global. Why did I say global when we're talking about Vermont?
Migratory.
Thank you. Because a lot of them are migratory in nature. And so we find that as an example of what one of those species is, we'll use this bird, which is kind of our poster bird for the Bird Friendly Maple Project. Anybody know what this bird is? It says it right up there in the corner.
It says it right.
Yeah, that's the Scarlet Tanager. We see the male here, the bright red scarlet with the black wings in its breeding plumage. So this is what we would see if we were out in the sugar bush in the summertime and we hear this bird. It sounds kind of like a robin singing away, but it's kind of a huskiness, scratchiness to its voice. You're going to have a Scarlet Tanager in that case. What's the bird below it? This is a trick question.
Female, maybe?
The most logical guess is that it's a female, and in fact the female during the breeding season does look a lot like that, but that's actually a male as well.
Immature or something?
That is a male right now in the non-breeding season. So if we went to where this bird is wintering in South America right now, and we saw that, we'd be looking at the Scarlet Tanager. So the female does look a lot like that. Her wings aren't as dark, starkly dark, black as that, or the black on the tail, but that more olivey, drab color is what the female will have during the breeding season. So many of the forest birds that make up that high richness of species that we find in our forest fit into this, what we call neotropical migratory bird group. And Scarlet Tanager is a great example. We see on the map the orange color being the extent of its breeding range. So here in Vermont, we actually fall really almost at the northern range of where we find that bird nesting. In migration, it goes down through the southeast U.S., works its way down through Central America, and wintering down in South America. And that term, neotropical migrant, really refers to a group of birds that the majority of their breeding population, summer population, is north of the Tropic of Cancer, and the majority of the wintering population is south of the Tropic of Cancer. So that's, if you've ever heard that term before, or you will hear it more in the future, that's what that term neotropical means. Majority of breeding population north of the Tropic of Cancer, and the wintering being south of that line. But both our maple industry and these birds do share something in common, and it's this, our forest resource. So without the forest resource out there, the forested landscape that we have here so prominently in northern New England, we really wouldn't have a maple industry, and we wouldn't have the bird communities that we find out there today. So here's a sugar bush, in Starksboro, Vermont, which has a lot of what we're looking for in terms of habitat for these birds. We're going to get into more of that here later on. But when we have a sugar bush that really looks a lot like that, we are likely to find that we get a lot of that richness of bird species being attracted to it for nesting sites. And when we think about habitat for anything, including ourselves, go back in your memory banks to elementary school. What are the main components of habitat? What is it that something needs to have in order for it to want to be there and live there? Water, food, shelter. Those are kind of the big three. And then space is another one, having the area. You were going to say that, weren't you? I know you were. They need to have room to move around and do all those things. Look for food, find shelter and places to put their nests in order to raise that next generation of their species. For these birds, and many of the other birds in our forest, The primary thing that they're looking to feed on during the time they're here with us are insects. So all types of insects. Most commonly, though, it's the larvae, Lepidoptera, so butterflies and moths is one of the main food sources for them. Some species will dig around in the leaf litter on the forest floor. They'll be looking for spiders, other insects, spiders, and other arthropods that are living there. But these birds are kind of iconic to our northern hardwood forests and our sugar bushes here in Vermont. We already know what that top left one is Scarlet Tanager. Does anyone recognize, this is not a test by the way, but anybody recognize either of the other two?
One of them looks like a baby robin. But it's
Looks like a baby robin. Okay, so it's
It's
actually,
robin, a thrush.
it's not, but it's in the same, robins are thrushes,
Thrushes, yeah.
and that is a thrush. It's not our state bird, which you all know. The hermit thrush, it's not that.
Is the wood thrush?
Wood thrush.
A wood
Yeah,
thrush.
so that's a wood thrush. Very prominent dark spotting you'll find on its breast there. And then kind of that white circle you'll see around the eye ring. How about the one on the bottom? Any ideas at all? It's okay.
Not a great picture.
It's a warbler, so these are groups of birds. You have tanagers, thrushes, vireos, warblers, and there's a whole bunch, most of these have a variety of species within them. This one is great because it's named after the way it looks. What color is its throat? Black. Black-throated. What color is its head and back?
Black-throated blue warbler.
Black-throated blue warbler, yeah, is the name of that bird. And I put these birds, their photos, really where we would expect to find them nesting in a forest. To show us that not all birds nest way up high in the canopy. In fact, rarely any of them do. So they're really looking for places lower in the forest where there's good, dense cover for them to put a nest, conceal that nest, and hopefully raise that next generation of their species. So our black-throated blue warbler pretty much exclusively puts its nest within the first 5 to 6 feet of the ground. So having a good, dense understory layer of native trees or shrubs, so whether that's sugar maple saplings, red oak, yellow birch, or hobblebush, or striped maple, all those native things can provide, as long as they're making dense pockets of vegetation, great places for that bird to nest. Our wood thrush is going to go a little higher, typically in what we call the mid-story layer of the forest, 6 feet to about 30 feet up is where you'll find its nest, and then our scarlet tanager of all of these is really one of the higher nesting species. Not necessarily way up in the upper canopy, but tends to be higher than 30 feet in many situations. So this is what we call structure, forest structure, having layers of vegetation in any forest, whether that be a sugar bush or not. But just to set the stage and the context of why Audubon came together with our partners to think about developing this project back in 2014. So as we sit here today, we've got a variety of goals for the Bird Friendly Maple Project and kind of broad goals, and put them up here. First one is to promote sugar bush management that integrates bird habitat with sap production. So even for folks that aren't really getting involved with Audubon in this program, we'd like them to at least be aware of the fact that their sugar bushes are really important for a variety of things, including bird habitat, and promote ways that we can manage those sugar bushes through different forestry techniques to not only produce high quality sap, but also create good habitat for these bird species as well. And really the goal with that, obviously Audubon as a bird conservation group, we want to see our forests supportive of birds and being able to have birds being in any forest able to raise that next generation of their species. That's our job as the breeding grounds for these neotropical migrants. They're not nesting right now. So when they're in that Scarlet Tanager in South America, it's not raising young. It's just hanging out, feeding, and waiting to come back up here in the springtime. We want to be able to recognize maple producers for their intentional efforts to integrate birds into sugar bush management. I'm going to guess right now that many of you already are doing things in your sugar bush or have a sugar bush that structurally, with the vegetation that's there, is already pretty friendly to birds. Do you have any way of communicating that to consumers? Not really, unless you make that something that you want to talk about. So we want to recognize folks for doing what they're doing, and we have a variety of ways for making that happen. And I think we have somebody in our room who is part of this. That's right, so I thought so. And again, so on top of that, we want to increase the public awareness of the connections between Vermont's maple industry and bird conservation. Make there a demand among consumers to see that there's something here between that when people are making maple syrup, they can also be doing things that support biodiversity, in particular birds. And then finally, just promoting pure Vermont maple products as the best sweetener that we could have as compared to the alternatives to that. This is really the healthiest and the best for the environment, maple syrup production. So we want to be able to promote that as well. If folks have questions at any time, or I'm going too fast and something didn't make sense, don't be afraid to jump in and ask. Okay, so perhaps the most important point of this entire presentation is coming up next when I push the button. You ready for it? Sugar bushes are inherently good. Any sugar bush is inherently good for birds because they keep forest as forest. And of all the threats that face birds, forest birds, and forest biodiversity, what's the number one threat? The loss of that forest to some other use. So it's converted to something else. I don't know of any sugar bushes where people want to make maple syrup that they go out and they turn it over and convert it to another use, because then you've lost your opportunity to do that. So that in itself is really important to remember. It's important for the public to know that just because a maple producer may not be putting labels on their products that say produced in bird-friendly habitats, which I'll show you here in a little bit, doesn't mean they're doing things bad for birds. But what it does mean when you put that sticker on is that you are intentionally making efforts to enhance the habitat value of that sugar bush, so that not only are you producing high-quality, pure Vermont maple products, you're doing it in a way that is also supporting this huge diversity of birds that want to be nesting in there. So if nothing else sticks with you when you leave the room today, I hope this is the one thing. Hope there's more, but if nothing else, I hope this is it. So sugar bushes are great places for birds. Now, again, the difference then is how we manage those sugar bushes. It can make the difference between just okay, a place where birds can go, or a place where birds can really be productive, where they can successfully raise the next generation of their species. Because ultimately, bird conservation, we want to keep populations going, which means having new young being produced every year. And our management can make it just okay, where maybe the birds aren't nesting successfully, or it can make it where they are nesting successfully and getting out young that will fledge and head to their wintering grounds. So part of the program that I'm really going to focus on today is what we call the recognition, the Bird-Friendly Maple Recognition Program. And actually, there's your family, right there. Standard Farm. Yep. In Standard, Vermont, Northeast Kingdom. Is the recognition of maple producers for, again, doing these things intentionally, that they're thinking about birds out there. I did not put up there a bird-friendly maple certification. And that's because at this point in time, we are not calling it a certification. Because certification implies, in most cases, you have a third party that comes in and verifies something. And we don't have that. We have myself, and we have the producers. And we work together, and we say, okay, you're doing certain things, which we'll get to, and we're going to recognize you for doing that. Now, at some point in time, I'm hoping that we do move it to a third-party certification. Perhaps using folks that do NOFA certification can also go and do the certification around this program. But at this point in time, it's called a recognition, and this is just a smattering of, we currently have right now just over 50 maple producers in Vermont, which are recognized through this program as doing things intentional in their sugar bush to enhance bird habitat. So let's say you're interested in doing that. What does that mean? What is it that we would ask you to do? And that's what we're really going to walk through here during the rest of the presentation, is giving you an idea of what it is we're looking for. It's on, if you picked up the handout, If you didn't, you can grab it at the end, but you can grab one of these. Pretty much everything I'm going to be talking about is on here, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail and give you a chance to ask questions. So these are all things that, whether or not you're looking for recognition, they're just good things to think about if birds are of any interest to you in managing those woods. But for the recognition program, these are things we're going to be specifically asking you to do or looking for to make sure we're maximizing the bird habitat value of those woods. So the very first, these are called the general requirements. This is the front side of the paper, the handout that you got. Number one, within the last 10 years, forest management plan must be in place. This is something that for some folks has been a turnoff in wanting to get involved with the program because they're equating it with meaning I'm in current use or the use value appraisal program where you get, it's an equitable, folks familiar with current use? It's an equitable tax program, so you get taxed at a different rate. It does not necessarily mean that. If you are in current use, you'll have to have one of these anyway. A forest management plan, it's at least every 10 years it gets updated. But if you're not, we're going to ask you to have one anyway. Because not only is it important how the woods are today, and what's the structure like, what's the species composition look like in those woods, but it's also important how we think about what we're going to do in the future. So that planning process that will inform your management in the future is critical. I would almost argue more important than the current condition of the woods today. And having something written down that helps guide you in what you're going to do in the future is really, really important to that. So a current forest management plan in place, we ask for folks to, at a minimum, again, even if you're not in current use, put a plan together that meets the minimum standards for Vermont's current use program. And ideally, it even goes beyond that and gets into greater discussion of some of these things. Along with that comes a forest bird habitat assessment, which is conducted either by Audubon or a licensed forester that has the skills and has worked with us to be able to do that. What this does, this assessment, is coming out into the forest, spending some time going around and doing an inventory and assessment of what you have there specific to habitat. So a forester, if you have a forester, again, how many of you do work with a forester?
Sort of half.
Sort of half, okay. So how many of you have a management plan currently? Okay.
I'm not sure about current.
All right, that's okay. You have something. You have something written down. So a forester, to put together a forest management plan, they come out and they do an inventory. They identify what do we have to start with, and then that guides. You put that together with your goals and objectives, and then that informs your actions. So we want to do that with habitat elements too. So we'll come out, we'll walk the woods, we'll go to sample points to collect data specific to the habitat attributes that we're looking for, and that goes then into a planning process later on. So those two things have to be in place right up front. Number three, harvesting is minimized during the bird nesting season. So generally from May through mid-July is when birds have returned. They've built nests, they've laid eggs, they've hatched those young, and the young are fledglings, meaning they're in the nest still and being fed and cared for. After that point in time, most birds have finished their nesting cycle. The young are still there, the adults are still there, the young are out of the nest as fledglings, they're able to move around, they're mobile, they can move if someone's coming in and doing some cutting. But this time in May through mid-July really is potentially the most disruptive to birds. So we're asking, and it goes into a little more detail in the handout, but what we say there is that any one area of your sugar bush, if you're going to go in and do some work, we're asking that you don't go into that one area any more than once every 10 years during this time of year. So if you're in there in the wintertime and you're doing some thinning or something, that's fine. You can do it every year if you want to. But in this window of time, when the birds are on nests, on eggs, or tending to their young, we're trying to just minimize how much disruption is happening there. Okay? Any questions with that? Does that make sense? Okay. The sugar bush must be part of a contiguous forest block of greater than 100 acres. You don't have to own those 100 acres, and you don't have to have management authority over those 100 acres. But we do want to see a fairly large block of forest that we're going to be working on. There's a reason for that. A lot of these birds use what we call interior forest. It means they're not found on the edges of woods. or necessarily in small patches of woods surrounded by open land or agriculture. They like large swaths of forest. That's where they tend to go. That's where they are most likely successful in nesting. If you had a 5-acre sugar bush in Addison County, right, and it's surrounded by agricultural land, the chances of a wood thrush, which may be attracted to it because it has everything they're looking for, the chances of them actually nesting successfully and raising young are probably pretty low because of the outside influence of the landscape around them, of that agricultural landscape. There's more kind of generalist predators, raccoons, maybe in some cases even house cats if you have a lot of residential development nearby. And so birds will nest and their young won't, or cowbirds is another thing in agricultural settings. So that becomes what, in our biologist world, a population sink. It means birds went there, they nested, they had young, and none of them survived. We don't want that. We don't want to attract a bird to a spot to doom it to failure. So by having a big block of forest, we can hedge against that happening and give the birds a better opportunity. And I've never had anybody not able to meet this requirement thus far, because there's a lot of forest land out there. And then the last one is probably the most confusing, natural community conversion considerations. So there are places that you wouldn't look at and say, hey, that's a sugar bush. Look at all the sugar maple that's in there. It might be a red maple swamp as the natural community type that's there. We want to make sure that we're not unduly doing something to force that forest to be a sugar bush if it doesn't really want to be. So to go into a red maple swamp, for example, which is probably going to have a lot of wet soils, and really trying to make it promote any sugar maple that's there and remove the red maples, we want to minimize against that. So working within the natural systems that are already in place, the natural communities that are in place, and managing them according to that natural community, as opposed to managing it for strictly a sugar bush. Okay? Any questions on that? That's just the general background stuff. Now we're going to get into what do we actually look for habitat-wise in the woods. All right, so number one really is tree species diversity. And probably not a new concept to anybody here, but we're going to talk about specific to birds, because we hear about it in other contexts many times. But what does that mean for birds? So the first thing we're looking for in a sugar bush, and we would take, if you have multiple forest stands that make up your sugar bush, we're going to look at all of them and kind of average it all out together. If you just have one small pocket of tapped woods, we'd look at that. Sometimes people will say, I only have 15 acres of sugar woods, but I've got 200 acres of hemlocks and red spruce and northern hardwoods over here. I've got diversity taken care of. Sorry. It doesn't quite work that way with this program, because we're talking about a bird-friendly sugar bush, not what the rest of your forest might look like. And in cases where someone might have 500 acres of sugar bush and own 1,000 acres in total, they say, well, the other 500 acres is where my species diversity is. I'm going to keep pretty much a monoculture in these 500 acres. Doesn't really make it a very bird-friendly place. So no matter what the acreage involved, we only look at the tapped sugar bush woods. If you have a management plan, that would be based on, in that plan, it says which forest stand is your sugar bush. That's what we would be looking at. So what we're looking for is greater than 25% of the sugar bush be in something other than sugar maple. And that's done through a measurement called basal area, which is a very common forestry measurement. So that means you can have up to 75% sugar maple, but then the rest of it would need to be something else. In those cases where currently sugar maple does comprise more than 75% of the basal area, we want to see in your forest management plan that you're going to address that in some way. How are you going to make sure, as this forest continues to develop in time, in the future, that we're managing for these other non-sugar maple species so that we can help build that diversity over time? Do we think that's going to happen overnight? No. We have to think, and this is the hardest part for anybody, whether you're a maple producer, a general forest landowner, or anybody walking down the street, thinking in forest time. Forest time is not human time. Things happen over very large time frames. If we're managing it, we have to start thinking more like a forest and less like humans. Because we have to be willing and patient for things to happen. So we don't expect you to convert to having great tree species diversity in a week or two. It's going to happen over time, and your management over time is what's going to get it there. So what does that look like? We want to see that in the plan. How about non-native and invasive plants? Anybody have those on their property? Honeysuckle? No? Awesome. Not that you know of? Okay. It's kind of a big issue in a lot of forests in Vermont, especially here in southern Vermont. Many forests have these non-native, and we call them invasive because they tend to take over once they become established. Things like honeysuckle, buckthorn, Japanese barberry, multiflora rose are all plants that were brought here from somewhere else for various reasons, some intentional, some not so intentional, and they've gotten a foothold and they kind of take over. That's the invasive part. And when they do, they really can prevent any native vegetation from being able to survive. A lot of these plants produce prolific berries, fruits. Remember what birds eat most of the time when they're with us? Insects. But as they get ready to migrate for the fall, they now add to their diet a lot more fruit. So they start eating whatever fruits they can to build fat on their body that will fuel them on that long migration. When the landscape is filled with these non-native plants and the berries that are on them, the birds will eat them. But they don't give them the same fitness. They're not as healthy for those birds because those birds haven't evolved over time to be eating these things. And so those birds can leave here not in the best of shape, as if they were eating the native plants, native fruits. And the other thing is non-native plants tend to support lower insect diversity. So even during the time when the birds are nesting and feeding their young in a landscape dominated by non-native plants, there are less insects for them to be feeding on. So if you have these or not, that's the other thing it says down here, even if you don't have them, we want to see in that plan, management plan, what are you going to do to address that issue? We're not going to say what you need to do. We want you to be aware that you have or could have a problem with invasives and think about what it is you're going to do to minimize the abundance out there. We're not trying to eradicate in most cases anymore. Certain places where there's a lot of non-natives, eradication, which would imply total getting rid of them, isn't even feasible in some spots. But managing them and reducing them is certainly something that we can do. So we want to see that kind of covered under this species diversity. This is what are the plants that make up your sugar bush? What does the species diversity look like? The next part is how are those plants arranged? What does the structure of the forest look like? So this is where I talked earlier about that layering of vegetation, understory, midstory, and then the canopy overhead. So in our forest management plan, we want to see some descriptions of how you're going to either tend to your sugar bush or regenerate it. Do those terms, tending and regeneration, resonate with anybody? Kind of, sort of, maybe a little bit. So stand tending would essentially mean, actually that's your sugar bush right there too. Stand tending would basically mean we've got these tappable trees, or maybe some smaller trees that aren't quite of diameter yet to tap, but how are we going to tend to those to keep them there and continue to have them over time? So that's where we do things like thinning or crop tree release, if you've ever heard of those forestry terms. It's tending to what you have. Regeneration, on the other hand, as it implies, we're actually trying to grow the next forest or begin the growth of the next forest underneath. So you've got young trees down here that will be the future forest someday when those big tall trees are no longer there. So there's different ways we can manage a forest to get that regeneration started. Or perhaps there's already a little bit of it there. How are we going to encourage its growth through how we manage the forest? So that's the regeneration side of things. One of the hardest things to tell maple producers sometimes is that in both stand tending and regeneration, maybe I'll whisper it so it doesn't pick up on here. Sometimes you have to cut a maple tree. Ooh, I saw the reaction. It's a hard one, isn't it? It's a hard one. You're a sugar maker, and you're telling me to cut some maple trees. Sometimes you really should. You really need to. If you've got a young sugar maple stand of stuff that's 7, 8 inches in diameter, and you look up and their crowns are all like this, because there's so many of them packed in there. None of those trees, even though they're all sugar maple, are going to produce very high sugar content sap. Because what does a tree need? Not you. What does the tree need to make sugar?
Leaves.
Lots of leaves. The more leaf you have, leaf area, the more sugar you're going to create. So you want those trees to be able to expand their crowns. Lots of leaf area on there, which might mean taking out a maple here and there so that the nicest ones can do that. I love the reaction. Because it's the same no matter what. You don't have to get
Against the law.
It's not against the law. As long as it's in your management plan. Right, so.
But it should be.
Um,
Gotta get a permit.
yeah, so just, sometimes you do. Not every woods, we would necessarily say that. If you only had 25% sugar maple and they were all really big crowns, you probably don't have to cut any sugar maples right now. But some stands are going to require that. Then we're going to do a little bit of eyeballing, or in our world we call it ocular estimation, to look at something called the percent cover of understory and midstory vegetation. So as I look at this forest, I'm looking at the understory. Remember how tall I talked about the black-throated blue warbler? How many feet high does it tend to nest in? 5, 6 feet.
Yeah.
5, 6 feet tall. That's the understory. So at every sample point when I'm doing my inventory, I'm going to be looking out around me. I'm going to estimate what's the percent cover of the shrubs and saplings in that layer. And then I'm going to average all that out at the end. And hopefully we have at least an average of 25% cover. Because if we don't have 25% cover, which bird is not going to find nesting habitat?
The ground.
The black-throated blue warbler, right? The one that we saw that nests. Yeah, anything that's nesting. Oh, there he is, right there. The black-throated blue warbler. That's the one that needs that. We want to see that there's places for that bird to nest. We're also going to do it for the mid-story, that 5 to 30 foot layer. Generally, that's not a problem. Many forests, sugar bushes, have a pretty good developed mid-story, even if it's the lower branches of the canopy trees providing some cover. But a lot of times that understory just isn't there to the percentage cover that we'd like it to be. That's a function of our forest age. A lot of our forests are still pretty young, because we're thinking about forest time, right? So a forest that's 60, 80, 100 years old, 60 years in particular is a pretty young forest. It may not yet be in its developmental stage, somewhere where you've got that young growth coming in just yet. But we can manage to get some of these features to be present. So where we don't have the percent cover of mid-story and understory, again, we want to address that, discuss it, and say how we're going to work toward achieving that in our forest management plan. The dead stuff. Dead things are important too in the forest. All forests have dead things. They have standing dead trees, which are called snags. Sometimes you have standing live trees that have holes in them that birds excavated out and they're nesting in. Those are called cavities. So we'd like to, on average, after we've done our inventory, see that you have at least 2 snags and or cavity trees greater than 10 inches in diameter, breast height. That's what DBH, so this high, off 4.5 feet off the ground, out there. And
Per acre?
average per acre. Yep. The general forest management, if it's a non-sugar bush, the general forest management guideline on that metric is 6 or more per acre. When we developed these guidelines for maple producers, we said, that's a hard one. Not only is it hard to ask somebody to cut a maple tree, but imagine asking them to leave 6 or more of these dead trees all throughout their pipeline.
Yeah.
Because that stuff comes down, right, invariably. So to make sure we have something, we reduce that number to this 2. That's my sugar bush right there. And that snag / cavity tree, you see all those holes, that bird next to it, the pileated woodpecker, not a migrant bird, but a bird that uses our forest, did all of that. And that's intentional for me to leave that tree there, even though I know someday it's going to come down. I have stuff come down all the time anyway, and it requires me to go out there. And I'm working in this forests world, and so I'm willing to put up with whatever the forest deals me. Sometimes it's a pain in the butt, but without that forest there and a healthy forest, I'm not going to be doing this thing anyway, called sugaring. So I'm going to leave that stuff out there, and we ask that folks think about that and leave it too. When that piece of wood comes down, that snag comes down, it creates this thing called coarse woody material, logs on the forest floor. We'd like to see at least four pieces of that are at greater than 10 inches in diameter and at least 3 feet long on average throughout your forest. Of the 50 plus sugar bushes currently recognized in this program, not one of them has not met that goal. Most of them are in the 30 to 40 pieces of coarse woody material per acre. It's not a hard one to achieve. And in fact, in the future, as I reevaluate these standards in time, that number is going to go up, because it really should anyway. A lot of these metrics, and I wanted to mention this up front, I forgot to, we wanted to make sure that as we develop these standards, that we weren't contrary to some of the other programs that are out there. So if you're organic, you have certain standards. If you're in current use, you have certain standards. We didn't want to do something that was going to be totally different from any. If you get NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service funds, to do work in your woods, they have guidelines, standards. So we wanted to be somewhat consistent with those. That's where that 4 pieces of coarse woody material came from, NRCS, and it's too low. So we'll look at that in the future. So again, whether or not you have these things already, we want your plan to talk about them. How are we gonna, if we have them, that's great, but how are we gonna, over time, make sure we always have more of them? Because that snag isn't always gonna be there, standing. It's gonna be coarse woody material someday. Do I have any other snags to take its place when that comes down? I do, and that's written into my management plan that talks about how I'm gonna achieve that. And then the last one here on our dead stuff, if you are out cutting and doing some thinning, we are not, we're asking folks to not do whole tree harvesting. Familiar with that term? Essentially means when you cut a tree, you drag the whole tree from the forest, and you utilize, in most cases, all parts of it, including the fine branches. The tops, the fine branches, we want to see that left in the forest, creating these essentially piles of fine woody material, smaller branches that create essentially brush piles, because we have other wildlife, birds and other wildlife that are using those. And also, other ecological value here, how many of you have deer in your sugar bush that eat every little new young tree that grows? Bruce does, I know he does, right? A lot of us do. There's a lot of deer out there in some parts of the state, especially here in southern Vermont. After you've done some work in the woods and leaving those tops scattered across the forest floor, you've got seedlings that are going to start working up through there. The deer aren't likely to go in there to forage, to browse on those seedlings when you have all this mess all everywhere. Eventually those trees get tall enough that they're above the deer browse. So not only does it provide good habitat by leaving it there, it actually helps with your regeneration of your forest by providing some protection for seedlings to actually grow. And those seedlings create what layer of the forest? Understory. For birds like the black-throated blue. Look at that. It's catching on. Excellent. Okay. So after we've done our inventory and assessment, then we take all that information, we, Audubon, and we write up a report for you that describes the current condition of the sugar bush, and it identifies any gaps between the current condition and what we're looking for. That report comes to you. You read through it. Hopefully it makes sense. The last page is a signature page where it bullet points, here's what we'd like you to do. If you agree to address those bullet points through your future management, you sign off on the last page. Is it legally binding? No, of course not. But it's in good faith that by signing off, you're going to be doing these things. We recognize you at that point. So you send it back to me, I sign it, and then we're done. You are recognized as managing for a bird-friendly sugar bush. Last point there in bold. The recognition is for agreeing to intentionally incorporate bird habitat into sugar bush management. It does not necessarily mean that when you sign that paper, all of a sudden your woods are perfect for birds, right? Because we have to think like a forest, and forest time takes time. So it's how you're managing to get there, even if you're not there today. That's what we're recognizing you for, are those efforts. Otherwise, instead of having 51 or 50 or so producers today that are recognized, I might have 2. And it would be another 10 years before I'd have anybody else recognized. So it's your efforts to do so that we're recognizing. What are the benefits to being recognized? Well, there's some marketing benefits that come with it. So I brought along some show and tell. So one of the things that you get, you saw the sign. So you got this metal sign you can put up at your sugar house or wherever you'd like to go. Some folks that do farmers markets will bring this along and hang it up on their tents too. You get labels, depending on the size of your sugar bush. If you're, a couple thousand taps, we'll probably just give you this roll of 500. If you're big ones, you might get 2 rolls of these. There's 500 on the roll that you can affix to your maple products. And I think that the new Vermont Maple Sugar Makers Association jugs, the color, doesn't that look good? I think the label looks pretty nice on that jug. And so you can affix it wherever you'd like to, of course, on your syrup, but it helps to denote to your customers that you're part of this program. And then the last thing that you get are what we call the counter cards. It's essentially something that you can give to a customer. This is really, retail markets, if you're retailing your syrup, if you sell it at all, this is where it really comes into play, this program. For people that are putting it in barrels and selling it to Bascom's today, it doesn't mean much from the market side of things, because Bascom's, Butternut Mountain, they're not distinguishing this and putting it aside separately. Maybe someday, but not today. So if you're retailing it, it's when you really can tell the story about what you're doing. And so this card, not only does it show some of the top birds that are in sugar bushes, direct from my own graduate level research on this topic. These are the most common birds in sugar bushes that are on here. And the back kind of briefly describes what's the challenge, what's the solution that we're trying to address with bird conservation. So we've got that, and then we have on our Audubon Vermont website, which I'll show you in a minute, we list you up there, and we even have what's called a story map, where we can get into a little bit more. I'll show you that here in just a moment. Enrollment in the program is currently at no cost to maple producers. So that is thanks to we get grant funding, foundation grants, federal grants, to help us to be able to offer this program. We don't want it to be cost prohibitive, especially for a program that right now the markets aren't paying more money because you're putting that label on your syrup. At least not that I know of. But what I can tell you is that there are some producers who are putting that label on their products who now have new customers because of it. Great example, a pretty high-profile retirement senior living community in Shelburne, Vermont, called Wake Robin. Costs a lot of money to live there, and there's a lot of money there. They took on a new account for getting their maple syrup from a new producer because that new producer was involved in our program. So it's not, you're not getting more per, selling that. You're not getting, instead of 18 bucks a quart, I'm not charging 20, but you might get new customers because of it, which is a benefit. But someday, hopefully we'll see that there's a premium that can be paid, and that would be a different story. These are just really the benefits to you, the producer. There are benefits beyond that in the forest itself that I'm not going into today. Everything from climate resiliency of forests, when you manage with birds in mind, to insects and disease outbreaks. Maple monocultures, we've had forest tent caterpillar in Vermont the last few years. They don't eat red maple. So if you mix in some other smattering of species there, it doesn't mean there's not going to be any forest tent caterpillars, but they're not going to just be wide open smorgasbord. It's all there, what I'm looking for. So there's other benefits beyond the benefits to you. All right, so here's this is kind of our landing page for our website. This is the Vermont Maple Farm. These folks and their farms, their what's the word I'm looking for? Farmers market. Thank you. Their farmers market stand that they have. But so we have a listing here, and I just wanted to show. So take my word for it. There is a website where I list all the producers with some basic information, contact name of the farm, if there is farm name of the people that are running it, your contact info, and the products that you sell. And whether you have a website if you do that, or you can just call you up if that's the best way to get you. Then this story map is essentially it's a GIS, it's a mapping program that we can put up on a state of Vermont map, little flags, numbered flags, and you click on the flag and it brings you to the producer. It shows a picture and it talks a little bit more about your story. And we're really telling a story with this too. Good marketing is the story behind all of this. So it provides another layer of getting your information out to potential customers. And that pretty much wraps up what I have to share today, but I certainly take any questions that you have, comments, sky's the limit from here on. If you haven't done it already and you'd like, on the bench, if you want the syrup, you can have it. But the guidelines and then a brochure on the program, kind of a general program brochure, please feel free to grab any of those. But does anybody have any questions?
I do.
Yeah.
This may seem odd, but I don't own property in Vermont. I don't live in Vermont.
Okay.
I'm about an hour south of here in Massachusetts.
Okay.
Is there any Massachusetts Autobahn or any connection or any?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So, great question too. So this program, it had to start in Vermont, right? It had to, because we lead the country in syrup production. Since that we started in 2014, Audubon New York is working with their state producers association, and they're currently piloting it in New York City. The Massachusetts Audubon Society, which is not, and I won't bore you with details, they're not part of the National Audubon Society, which is what we are.
Of course.
They're their own independent.
Typical Massachusetts.
Yeah, they actually predated National Audubon. They're the original Audubon. They are. I've been having conversations. Their Maple Producer Association there wanted to do this, so they connected with Mass Audubon, and they're talking about how they can make it happen. So I would say, are you a member of your state producer association?
Yeah.
Tell them that you want to see it happen,
Okay.
and that will help to maybe move the process along.
Same
So,
question with New Hampshire.
New Hampshire's not there, right? New Hampshire's not there yet, not yet. I mean, I haven't gotten requests from New Hampshire. Same with Audubon, like, New Hampshire Audubon is not part of National Audubon. Well, here's how you know. Here, this is the inside scoop. When you see Audubon and then the state name, Audubon Vermont, Audubon New York, that means it's a state program of National Audubon Society. If it's not that, then it's an independent organization, not affiliated with National Audubon. Doesn't mean they can't do bird-friendly maple, it's just they haven't reached out yet to do that. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you were saying there's no cost, but I'm going to assume that the landowner would bear the cost of their dealing with whatever took
Sure.
in the management plan.
Yes.
And what about the assessment?
Yeah, the assessment is at no cost.
That's at no cost.
So the no cost part, really, and thanks for the clarification, is if you're organic, you pay an annual fee to NOFA or your state organic, just to be organic.
Right.
We don't have that. We don't charge you to get involved. So I come out at no cost to you. You get the report, you sign off, you get this first set starter kit for free at no cost. When you run out of labels, you can then contact me and purchase more at
Right.
$10 a roll, right?
But then let's
But
say,
the
so I do
forestry-
have a use value
Yeah,
plan.
so
that would be
hiring your
my-
forester, that's totally separate,
Gotcha.
right? So you're still gonna employ that forester to work with you on seeing this stuff through.
This aspect of it.
Sure.
Right. Gotcha.
Yep.
I did have one other question, a little bit random, but back in one of your earliest slides, showing the density of the woodland birds.
Yep.
There was a couple of stripes, a north-south and a east-west stripe.
In New England?
Yes.
Yeah,
It
so-
looked like maybe Champlain Valley.
Yes, that's right.
And then I didn't, what was the east-west one?
That's right. So
I was
So
question.
most of Vermont is heavily forested. You
Right.
get into the Champlain Valley, and you still have forest, but you don't have as much.
Right,
So your forest bird richness of species diminishes. Then you get across into the Adirondacks,
right,
and it goes back. So you saw that right.
yes.
There's
And what
lower-
about the east-west one?
Trying to think where that one was.
I mean, to
It'd be
tie
the
up
same. It's gonna
same kind of
relate
thing.
to where the most forest cover is.
The mass spike, yeah.
Yeah, right.
A throughway in the mass pike.
Yes, and if you are, if you'd like to explore this more, and you grab the guideline sheet, my email address is on the back of that, on the bottom,
Perfect.
so feel free to be in touch. I do my visits to the woods May through September, as long as there's leaf on, foliage on the trees. That's how we estimate that percent cover and really can tell better what's happening in the forest. And we'd be happy to come out and visit with you.
How important are these areas also to the migratory population? Like coming from the north to the south and
Sure.
passing through?
Yep, absolutely. They are important because, again, if you're a migrant that nests in northern Canada, you need stopover sites, right, along the way.
Right.
And so having, again, just having forest as forest, it provides an important stopover site. We don't talk as much about that
Right.
as we do the breeding habitat aspect of it, but it is just as important. And then just like the last thing, this Scarlet Tanager and many of the others, right now when they're in their wintering grounds, they're in forests that support coffee shrubs. You heard of shade-grown coffee? Fair trade, bird-friendly coffee. There's bird-friendly coffee. That's actually where this idea spurred in me. Traditional coffee today, it's you remove the forest and you plant shrubs, coffee plants. That's not very bird-friendly, but coffee grows naturally in forest settings, under partial shade. And a lot of birds that nest in our sugar bushes winter in those coffee places. That part of the story we haven't told either, and if you haven't put maple syrup in coffee yet, you're missing it. So the connection there, the economics of our maple industry and the coffee industry and the biodiversity aspects of both, that's a whole nother story that we could tell. So, thank you.
Thank you.